Our reading again is our words from Desmond Tutu. Ubuntu is very difficult to render into a Western language. It speaks of the very essence of being human. When we want to give high praise to someone, we say, "You un Ubuntu." Hey, so and so has Ubuntu. When you are generous, you are hospitable, you are friendly and caring and compassionate. You share what you have. It is to say, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. We say a person is a person through other persons. It is not, I think, therefore I am. It says, rather, I am human because I belong. I participate, I share. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole, and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they were less than who they are. So Desmond Tutu was born in South Africa that completely disenfranchised Black people. Forged in 1910 of two colonial nations, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, South Africa's constitution allowed the colonial powers to rule with impunity and brutality. Among many devastating policies were those allowing for forced relocation, segregated townships, and pass laws, requiring Black folk to carry a passbook in order to prove they had permission to be in white areas. Interracial sex and marriage were illegal. Apartheid created what Alistair Sparks called the most comprehensive system of labor coercion on a racial basis that had been devised since slavery. So this is the country he was born into. Tutu came of age in a South Africa where hardline Afrikaner nationalists were elected in spite of growing global attention and concern. These hardliners ruthlessly suppressed any uprisings or resistance to the injustice of apartheid. Tutu met his beloved wife Leah while she was studying to become a primary school teacher, and he was teaching English and history in a local high school. However, both Leah and Desmond left the teaching profession in 1953 after that reactionary government passed something called the Bantu Education Act. The act created a separate, inferior education system for Black students in an attempt to ensure that Black South Africans would only ever be able to work at unskilled and semi-skilled jobs. In large part because of a close relationship with Father Trevor Huddleston, who we heard about in the story, a radical white priest, Tutu chose, after leaving education, to pursue ordination to the Anglican priesthood. As part of his training, he studied in England, where the contrast between his experience in South Africa and the milder forms of racism he encountered in England helped free him from any lingering internalized sense of inferiority. At which point he went back home and, while rising in the ranks of the church, used his position to speak out for human rights and against apartheid. Tutu embraced an understanding of Christianity as the source of nonviolent resistance. His commitment to nonviolence was bone deep, the result of his faith, but also he talks about it being a strategic choice. He realized fairly early on that in violent conflict, more Black South Africans would die, and they would probably lose any armed conflict at all. So he preached and taught and participated in protests. Interestingly enough, while he was arrested and kept overnight a time or two, he was never imprisoned, unlike Nelson Mandela, who, as a political leader, was imprisoned for 27 years. It may be that Tutu's status as a priest or his prominence internationally gave him some protection. In 1978, he became the Secretary General of the South African Council of Churches. The SACC was one of the only Christian institutions in South Africa where Black people had majority representation. But still, Tutu was the first Black leader. His primary goal as Secretary General was to make the SACC an effective human rights advocacy organization, and in that he was successful beyond his wildest dreams. His Nobel Prize, again awarded in 1984, granted him even greater access to the world stage, and he used it to the fullest, bringing attention to the heartbreaking situation in South Africa. In 1990, South African President de Klerk lifted the ban on opposition parties and freed Nelson Mandela from prison. The choice to decriminalize dissent, however, did not mark the end of apartheid. The following 4 years were not pretty. While Tutu and Mandela were deeply committed to nonviolence, many others on both sides of the conflict were not, to say the least. Eventually, though, Tutu and Mandela emerged as the political and spiritual leaders, respectively, of the battered nation. In 1994, Mandela was elected president, and in 1996, he asked Desmond Tutu to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which was convened to help heal the wounds of violence done both under apartheid and during the transition. Now, here's where he kind of came onto my radar, because in the early aughts, I happened upon this book, which is called No Future Without Forgiveness, and describes the work of the commission. It completely blew my mind. See, I am a lawyer's daughter, and I grew up with an understanding of justice as something that happened through the legal process. The court receives evidence, hears arguments, and then dispenses justice. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the TRC, embraced an entirely different paradigm, one rooted in relationship rather than an eye for an eye mentality. Mandela and Tutu came up with the idea in part because the battered country couldn't afford to prosecute all of the people who had committed violence with Nuremberg-style trials. So they proposed a process whereby victims could heal and perpetrators, so long as they confessed fully and accepted accountability for their actions, could be forgiven. The commission consisted of 3 committees. Excuse me. The Human Rights Violations Committee investigated crimes committed between 1960 and 1994, bearing witness to the atrocities committed on all sides. The Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee allocated small grants to survivors of violence to restore dignity and effect healing. For example, a widow could apply for funds to send her children to school, or a mother could apply for funds to place a gravestone for her son. Lastly, the Amnesty Committee heard applications from perpetrators and, in some but not all cases, granted amnesty from criminal or civil prosecution. Now, I want to focus on this last committee because I think their work was what was so revolutionary. In South Africa, they basically showed us that justice doesn't have to be retributive or even oppositional. If victim and perpetrator can see and recognize the fundamental humanity in one another, and if the perpetrator can accept full responsibility for their crimes, it turns out that justice can be served and simultaneously be in service of healing for both parties. Now, it wasn't a cakewalk. The conditions for amnesty were quite stringent. The act had to occur between 1960, the year of the Sharpeville massacre, and 1994, when Mandela was elected and the new South Africa came into existence. The crime had to have been politically motivated. Anger, greed, or other personal causes of violence were not valid motivation, only acts on the order of or on behalf of the former government or any of the liberation movements. The perpetrator had to make a full and honest confession of all of the facts, and the crime had to be proportional. The means had to be proportional to the ends. If these conditions were met, however, amnesty was granted. Victims could argue that the conditions were not met, but they could not block the giving of amnesty. Tutu writes, "Amnesty is not given to innocent people or to those who claim to be innocent. Thus, the process, in fact, encourages accountability rather than its opposite. It assists in the cultivation of a new culture of respect for human rights and the acknowledgement of responsibility and accountability by which the new democracy wishes to be characterized. One of the more fascinating things was that the process was intentionally set up so that there was no requirement that the perpetrator express remorse. Remember in the story, the red-haired boy never expresses remorse or says he's sorry. Now, it turned out that most of them did, and many even specifically asked for forgiveness from their victims or relatives of their victims. However, Tutu felt that if it were made a requirement, victims might believe it was only a self-serving gesture, and it might become a barrier to forgiveness instead of a way to make it more possible. Because all those who did express remorse did so without any prompting or benefit to themselves, there couldn't be any doubt that their remorse was genuine. Now, when we look at the work of dismantling racism, I believe the old model of retributive justice becomes a barrier. If an oppressed person has to provide evidence and documentation of discrimination, it puts a burden on them and can cause additional harm. Meanwhile, the person accused of causing harm has to defend themselves because that's how the system works. There's a forcing of this adversarial relationship that most often makes things worse, at least on a feeling level. And meanwhile, on the structural level, progress is painfully, heartbreakingly slow. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission then offered this new model, which is called restorative justice. The move away from crime and punishment toward accountability, acceptance of responsibility, and repair of relationship is one that, in my opinion, holds tremendous potential for our hurting world. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's data showing that restorative justice leads to more positive outcomes for both victims and perpetrators. A 2007 study of research projects concerning restorative justice done by the Smith Foundation found that when comparing, that when comparing restorative justice to conventional criminal justice, restorative justice substantially reduced repeat offending, albeit not universally, doubled or more the number of offenses that were able to be brought to justice, reduced crime victims' post-traumatic stress symptoms and related costs, provided both victims and offenders with more satisfaction that justice had been done, reduced crime victims' desire for violent revenge against their offenders, reduced the costs of criminal justice, and reduced recidivism more than prison in adults, and just as well as prison in youth. Restorative justice holds at its center the essential humanity of both victim and offender. By accepting responsibility for their actions and for the harm done, the offender, provided they aren't a total sociopath, is transformed by the experience. The victim, meanwhile, is affirmed and empowered and able to forgive. When I compare that to the way the conventional justice system can strip humanity away from people who are sent to prison, in an awful eye for an eye, punishment-driven way, it's clear for me which path offers more hope. Violence sanctioned by the state is still violence, and having been inside a prison, I can tell you there's a lot of emotional, spiritual, and personal violence that happens behind bars. Tutu writes, "Forgiving means abandoning your right to pay back the perpetrator in his own coin, but it is a loss that liberates the victim. Does the victim depend on the culprit's contrition and confession as the precondition for being able to forgive? There is no question that, of course, such a confession is a very great help to one who wants to forgive, but it is not absolutely indispensable. If the victim could forgive only when the culprit confessed, then the victim would be locked into the culprit's whim, locked into victimhood, whatever her own attitude or intention, and that would be palpably unjust." He continues, "I've used the following analogy to try and explain the need for a perpetrator to confess. Imagine you're sitting in a dank, stuffy, dark room. This is because the curtains are drawn and the windows have been shut. Outside, the light is shining and a fresh breeze is blowing. If you want the light to stream into that room and the fresh air to flow in, you will have to open the window and draw the curtains apart. Then that light, which has always been available, will come in, and air will enter the room to freshen it up. So it is with forgiveness. The victim may be ready to forgive and make the gift of her forgiveness available, but it is up to the wrongdoer to appropriate the gift, to open the window and draw the curtains aside. He does this by acknowledging the wrong he has done, so letting the light and fresh air of forgiveness enter his being. Isn't that beautiful? So I've witnessed restorative justice in action personally, albeit in situations that weren't criminal. It is a beautiful process, and it works to address micro and macro aggressions that occur in community, as well as other conflicts and incidents where people's behavior is out of sync with our UU values. The UU youth community uses a form of restorative justice in its CAC, or Community Action Committee process. When a youth breaks a rule, for example, engaging in inappropriate sexualized behavior or sneaking booze or drugs into a camp, a circle forms around that person. If they confess and take responsibility for their mistake, while there might be consequences for their misbehavior, eventually they're welcomed back into the community. If they deny it or protest their innocence and there's sufficient evidence to prove it, they are removed from the community. It's a pretty powerful process. Meanwhile, in adult Unitarian Universalist communities, restorative justice informs our conflict resolution and destructive behavior policies. When a person does something perceived by others as harmful, they're considered to be out of covenant. If they accept responsibility for their actions, they're able to recovenant, sometimes again with some guidelines or consequences or clear boundaries around their participation to keep the community safe. And if not, they're asked to leave. It's a way of holding simultaneously that need to keep the community safe and the need to uphold the inherent worth and dignity of the person who's behaving in ways that just aren't okay. I want to share one last passage from Desmond Tutu. He writes, "God does have a sense of humor. Who in their right minds could ever have imagined South Africa to be an example of anything but the most ghastly awfulness of how not to order a nation's race relations and its governance? We were a hopeless case if ever there was one. God intends that others might look at us and take courage. God wants to point to us as a possible beacon of hope, a possible paradigm, and to say, look at South Africa. They had a nightmare called apartheid. It has ended. Northern Ireland, or wherever, your nightmare will end too. They had a problem regarded as intractable. They are resolving it. No problem, anywhere, can ever again be considered to be intractable. There's hope for you too." After the work of the commission was completed, Tutu continued to work for peace and justice, including being an outspoken advocate for gay rights in the Anglican Church. He cared deeply about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and called on leaders on both sides to make compromises, even if that meant going against their own constituencies for the sake of peace. He spoke out on the need to combat the AIDS epidemic. He marched against the Iraq War. He also marched in a pro-Tibetan protest and befriended the Dalai Lama. To all appearances, the man never compromised his principles. All people were worthy of respect and should be afforded dignity. Full stop. In these days where we have so many intractable problems, may we be inspired by the life and work of Bishop Desmond Tutu to keep faith with the principles of nonviolence, with the spirit of Ubuntu. May we embrace the potential inherent in restorative justice, a natural and logical outgrowth of those same principles. May we be inspired to live into our interdependence and to work tirelessly for the liberation of the entire human race, maybe the entire planet. Above all, may our work for justice be motivated by love and not righteousness. So be it, and so may it be.
We raise our hands and we say, we will be free! All of us!
When you thought, say, of a thing like apartheid, and you saw so many who seemed to be supporting the racist policies of the former government in South Africa, and you say, how are we going to change? Well, I always say to people, remember, the sea is actually made up of drops of water. That what you do where you are is of significance. It may just be that your act of courage encourages someone else who was slightly more apprehensive.
If you think you can stop us from becoming free, you are going to be stampeded. For until blacks are free, no one in this country is going to be free.
Please join me in saying the words to embody our chalice flame. We extinguish this chalice that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light our paths as we leave this place. May it guide our way until we are together again. When a great soul dies, it falls to the rest of us to carry their legacy forward. May we be inspired and empowered by the stories and the words and the ideas that drove Bishop Desmond Tutu to be braver, to be kinder, to be warmer and more loving. For those of you who would like to head out, I say go in peace. We'll see you next week. For those of you who'd like to stick around for coffee hour, we'll send you into breakout rooms. Go in peace. I love you all.